Borthakur IAS Academy প্রস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা Borthakur IAS Academy.
Hello everyone, welcome to Borthakur IAS Academy. This is Funny. This is our daily Hindu analysis class for 6th September 2021. Let us begin with our first article without any further delay. So this is a little bit of an important article because this is regards to Nifa virus. A case was reported in Kerala, Kozhikode particularly, where a 12-year-old boy apparently died because of this virus. Now this is not the first time that there has been a virus outbreak, particularly of the Nifa virus, right? Since 1 decade or so, India has been, or there had been multiple instances of this virus outbreak in certain states. So what is Nifa virus, right? Nifa virus, or NIV as it is shortly called, is a zoonotic virus which transmits from animals to humans, right? It like SARS-CoV-2, it also transmitted from animals to humans. Now what are the process, how it is transferred from one person to the human or from an animal to a human? So it can also transmit through contaminated food or directly between people to people. But the virus is deadly because of its mortality rate. There has been instances of the virus transmitting or transferring from animals to humans, but there has been little cases where there has been a direct transfer from people to people. Now many of the illnesses or the symptoms are asymptomatic, meaning it is hard to find out whether the person has been infected with Nifa virus, at least in the initial stages, because of its asymptomatic nature. Now but like SARS-CoV-2, it also affects an individual's ability to respirate, right? It is an acute respiratory illness and also fatal encephalitis. These are the two things that are the outcome of someone contracting a Nifa virus. Now where does this Nifa virus come from? The first outbreak was in a village called Nifa in Malaysia. See, generally viruses like the international authority or international organizations tend to generally name the virus after the village that it first originates from. Like Ebola came from a river. Nifa is a village in Malaysia where the first case was reported. It was reported in 1998 and Malaysia, and later on it was again reported in Singapore in 1999. So the virus originated from Malaysia in 1998 in a village called Nifa. Now this was first reported there in humans. Among humans it was first reported in Malaysia. Now the primary transmission method or the transmission mode that happens in Nifa virus cases is mainly through consumption of contaminated food. So what generally happens is the fruit bat, or commonly known as flying fox, is an host for this virus, right? It acts as a reservoir for this virus. It acts as host reservoir for this virus. What is the reservoir for this? Which animal is the host reservoir for this virus? Fruit bat, which is also known as flying fox. So sadly, South Asia is a kind of a place where you find a lot of fruit bats, right? Or flying fox. This is their home. This entire region is their home. The climatic conditions are right for the survival, and you find a lot of these fruit bats or flying bats in South Asian countries like India, Malaysia and Singapore. All this region is known for this bats. You find these particular species of bat in this climatic conditions, and it happens that Nifa virus, right, fruit bat is the animal host for this virus. It transmits through these bats. Now not only that, there has been evidence that fruit bats were the animals that transmitted this virus to other animals like pigs, dogs, cats, goats, horses and sheep. So what is the common factor in all of those animals? All of those animals at one point or the other interact with humans. So this virus can transmit through food or saliva or urine from these animals, and when you tend to interact with any of those said animals, there is a greater chance that you are going to come in contact with either their saliva or their urine, or there might be a bad case of your food being contaminated by their saliva or their urine in certain cases. But nonetheless, this bat transmits the virus into animals like pigs, dogs, cats, goats, horses, and sheep. Now, how do humans get infected mainly? They get infected mainly by way of direct contact with any of those said animals. Right? So you see the transmission taking place where the food brat becomes the host reservoir for the virus, then it transmits to pigs, dogs, or other domesticated or undomesticated animals, where you see human interacting with those animals, then they come into contact with their saliva or urine of these infected animals, and through direct contact the humans get infected of this virus. Now, how do humans transmit from one person to the other? The cases are low, but there has been cases where if they come in direct contact, the virus has transmitted, but primarily in humans, the food is infected, right? That is how transmission takes place. The first outbreak of Nifa virus was observed in Siliguri. This was the village where it was first noticed. As I said, this virus is deadly because of its mortality rate. Let us look at the case of Siliguri itself. The total number of cases that were confirmed in that area were 66, right? But out of 66, 45 people succumbed to the virus, meaning out of 66 infected people, 45 who contracted the virus died because of that virus. Again, it is fatal encephalitis or acute respiratory problems. Again, like SARS-CoV-2, it is also a respiratory attacking virus, and that is why this virus is more deadly and concerning compared to SARS-CoV. Remember, what is the mortality rate for SARS-CoV-2? That is coronavirus. Anywhere between 1% to 2%, depending on how much of you are calculating, right? But the general awareness number that is accepted is 1%. But here you see most of the patients who contracted this virus dying because of this virus, because of the complications that arise out of this virus. That is the biggest concern. There is a small difference between SARS-CoV-2 and Nifa virus in other areas also. The area of transmission. When you look at SARS-CoV-2, the transmission, the R value as we call it, is 1.3 or anywhere between 1.3 and 1.5, meaning the rate of transfer among humans is high in SARS-CoV-2. But for Nifa virus, the R value is R0. The chances of transmission and spread among humans is very low, and even if it happens, the spread takes more time to transmit from one individual to the other individual, meaning the spread is far more slower. So, as far as right now, one case has been noticed in Kerala. There has been other instances in 2019 where there was an outbreak, but there are certain standards and procedures that they developed along with the central government that are in place that can be contained and localized. As far as all the outbreaks that happened in India, all of these cases have been localized and they were contained very quickly. But what is the biggest worry in this virus? The mortality rate. The survivability of the patient who contracts the Nifa virus is very low. So this is Nifa virus, which originated in Malaysia in 1999 from a village called Nifa. So there is a possibility that you might have to understand why Kerala is prone to such kinds of outbreaks. So my suggestion would be is to read a little bit about why Kerala becomes the epicenter of, what are the reasons behind that facilitate virus outbreaks in Kerala. From that perspective also you should kind of read a bit about it. Now moving on to next article. Judicial role in improving lawmaking. So before we deliberate on this article, let us discuss some background issues. Recently we discussed an article few months back where we found out that the productivity of our legislative body has gone down significantly. See, the report that was released by PRS Legislative was kind of indicative of the fact that despite passing high volume of bills, the amount allocated to debate, deliberate and discuss each and every bill had drastically gone down, where they came up with a number as to each bill was allocated anywhere between roughly 10 minutes to 15 minutes to deliberate on. So when you look at the legislative procedures, that is not how things are supposed to be. The legislative body, that is assembly, that is the parliament, is supposed to debate and deliberate on each and every bill. So you cannot say that just because a session or a parliament has been able to pass high volume of bills doesn't mean that they are doing their job correctly. That was kind of the conclusion that the PRS legislative and the authors of this article are coming at, right? You cannot simply say that this session passed or this parliament passed 22 bills. But when you go into the details, it functioned only for 22% of the time that was allocated to it. So majority of, 78% had not been utilized to either deliberate, debate or scrutinize any bills. The second part of parliamentary function is, we understand that bills cannot be deliberated upon endlessly. To scrutinize it in detail, to understand the possible fallout of those acts, generally these bills are suggested for or forwarded to special committees, right? Those are parliamentary committees. But later on, we also studied how bills are not being allocated or forwarded for scrutiny to parliamentary committees, making them redundant one way or the other. So, you cannot simply rule out by saying that we have passed 20 bills in this session, so the parliamentary session was a successful session. What is the intent of a parliamentary session? The intent is to deliberate and debate on the bills or the acts that are to be passed in that session. So, there is a deterioration in quality of deliberation, right, in parliament. This is not something new. This has been happening for a long period of time, and at various points of time, different stakeholders involved in the process, like civil society, the judiciary, sometimes even within the legislative bodies, have also asked that there needs to be an overhaul of the system, or there needs to be a reform so that we deliberate and discuss bills that transform into acts. Now, this problem was recently highlighted by Chief Justice of India, N.V. Ramana, in a meeting where he was noting that there are ambiguities and gaps in laws that are passed without meaningful deliberation, and as a direct result of this, litigations are being unnecessarily created, right? So, what he is suggesting is, or what the Honorable Chief Justice is suggesting is, because the meaningfulness of the debate is not present in permanent system or in the permanent structure, the bills are being passed and the acts are being promulgated, and these, as a result of this, as a result of lack of deliberation and debate on the necessity, the intent, the content of the bills, after the bill becomes act, these acts are again being challenged in courts, giving rise to unnecessary and avoidable litigation. So again, it would be waste of the court of the time. Again, it would be the waste of the legislative, because sometimes the acts are struck down without any further discussion. So there have been instances where the laws were struck down. Now, so before we further discuss this article, let us set a standard base. In India, we believe in the principles of separation of power, right? We have judicial activism on the one side, where the judiciary on its own tries to intervene in matters that it feels that are important to public and to protect public interests. But inherently, at any point of time, whenever there has been a case where we see judicial activism taking shape, there is always a concern: is the judiciary overreaching its authority? Is it overreaching into other areas of governance domains, whether it may be the legislative aspect of it or the executive aspect of it? Once you see that precedents being set where one organ of the government or one organ of the power structure in the country is trying to wrest control with the other organ, that is a slippery slope that nobody wants to be on, right? It sets a very bad quorum and precedence, meaning it sets the stage for in future where one organ of the government tries to control the other organ of the government. So when you say that a judiciary can play a crucial role in improving the lawmaking process, you have to say it with a lot of caution and veering, because it might set a wrong precedence that might end up in a bad place for everybody. So when we say that one organ of the government is going to intervene in the functioning of the other organ, you have to be very careful and you have to be mindful of the principles of separation of powers. So now, with that in mind, let us discuss what the authors of these articles are saying. Now, it is absolutely understandable to make a judgment or make a call that laws are being passed without adequate notice and deliberation, right? As a result of this, there is a greater chance that laws that are being passed might affect an individual's fundamental rights. Now, we have seen instances of that happening to where the courts had to intervene and try to interpret the law in a way that it doesn't infringe on an individual right or outright strike off that law that was being passed by the parliament, right? What is the minimum expectation of the legislative bodies or legislators? See, they are the representatives of the people, and their duty is that they have to take best of their care in casting their vote during a parliamentary session. Whenever a bill comes for vote, they have to consider, weigh the options, look at the pros and the cons, and then they have to cast their vote, right? Because without due deliberation, these laws tend to have a lot of consequences, and as we discussed in the earlier, because lack of debate, lack of deliberation, and lack of empirical evidence, right? You don't send those bills for consideration to parliamentary committees. As a result of it, you are losing a lot of expertise that can be given through the parliamentary committees. So the laws that are being passed are at a disadvantage of being not studied properly, right? This is not only the case with parliament, it is also the same case with state legislatives, right? You are seeing the same thing happening in state legislative assemblies also. Now, what is the precedence here? Now let us look at an example. The best example that we can find is voice votes, right? When you are passing a bill or when you are carrying out a voice vote to pass a bill, it is looked like how many members of parliament are saying ayes and how many members of the parliament are saying nays. But what is the case during voice votes? It is very hard to count how many people are saying ayes and how many people are saying noes. So there might be an instance where even if the number of people who are saying nays is higher, we may not find out how many actually said nays and how many actually said no ayes, because it is voice vote. When the bills are being promulgated or passed through voice votes, it is very unclear as to how many people are in agreement with the bill or against this bill, right? There is a real threat that bills may actually pass without securing the majority vote that is required under Article 100. One of the best example was the farm laws. The farm laws were passed through voice vote despite some objections, right? And we have seen the fallout of it in the recent concluded monsoon session also. So that would be the outcome of it. Where the entire monsoon session was disrupted. So that was one of the controversial laws that were passed through voice votes. So again, the voice votes again do not conform to Article 100, which says that a bill should pass with absolute some sort of a majority, if not absolute. The second area of concern comes through money bills, right? How do you certify a money bill? So there is a specific description that a money bill should possess, which is actually detailed under Article 110. But what is the biggest criticism of multiple governments? In order to bypass the scrutiny of Rajya Sabha, in order to bypass the entire discussion, debate, or the consent of Rajya Sabha, bills that are not necessarily money bills are being certified as money bills. Right? It's up to the speaker to decide whether a bill is money bill or not. The government says this is a money bill. The speaker of the parliament, right, Lok Sabha, has to decide whether that bill shall be allowed as a money bill or not. But we tend to see what happens in reality. Most of the bills are unchallenged. When a bill is certified as a money bill, then it tends to be passed as a money bill, and that takes out the scrutiny or the deliberation that has to take place in Rajya Sabha, and you see money bill being used whenever it seems necessary by the government in power, right? Article 110 particularly identifies 7 areas that can be governed through the enactment of money bills, which it clearly states that it should include imposition of tax, regulation of borrowing and appropriation of money out of the consolidated fund of India, and there are certain clear definitions as to or descriptions as to what entails a money bill. Like how the voice vote we gave an example of farm laws, we also have an example for money bills. The biggest example that one can identify with is the Aadhaar case, where it was challenged in the Supreme Court. Remember, Aadhaar was passed as money bill, and it was again challenged in the Supreme Court. And to an extent, the Supreme Court came out and said that you have to be careful on where you define or how you use the guard of money bill to pass your bills by passing the Rajya Sabha. So this is where we saw that Supreme Court can check certain deviations from the procedure by the Parliament. Right? This is where the Supreme Court stepped in and said that you have to conform to your procedural provisions. You have to comply with them. Otherwise, you are going to find some sort of an resistance from the Supreme Court. Now, judiciary has always been at a place where there is this thing called judicial review, where the judiciary makes deliberation and evaluates the constitutional validity of laws that are being passed by Parliament. That is judicial review. There is this already thing that we see and the courts perform called judicial review. Now, since you have judicial review, you see that at various points of time, the Supreme Court intervening and trying to establish or test the constitutional validity of laws. Right? This is where the authors suggest that court's role is to call the state to provide justifications explaining why the law is reasonable and therefore valid. So when a law is in front of the judiciary to be tested for its constitutional validity, generally the courts tend to ask the state to provide justifications and explain as to why do you think this is valid? What is the reason behind it? While they are doing that, they also tend to examine whether the reasonableness behind the measure that they are trying to pass. So they tend to deliberate, right, the reasons behind the bill that they are or the act that they have passed. So this is judicial review that already is taking place. Now, apart from this judicial review, there is also another important method where the judiciary can make deliberation a factor in evaluating the validity of laws, the constitutional validity of laws. Now this is called presumption of constitutionality. So this is a doctrine where the courts can exercise restraint and defer to legislative judgments on the reasonableness of law. I'll repeat. The other method that courts tend to invoke is the doctrine of presumption of constitutionality. So what is presumption of constitutionality? To understand the entire article, we need to do a little bit of deviation into this doctrine. So what is presumption of constitutionality? The term presumption of constitutionality is a legal principle that is used by courts during statutory interpretation, right? It is the process by which courts interpret and apply a law passed by the legislature, such as Parliament. This is again applicable to state legislatures also. This doctrine says the court ought not to interpret the statutory provisions unless compelled by their language in such a manner as would involve its unconstitutionality. Now, the courts should not interpret the statutory provisions unless the language that is used in the act would involve its unconstitutionality, right? It might be unconstitutional at the end of the day. Now, the presumption in this doctrine is it is always in favor of constitutionality of a legislation or a statutory rule. So the idea is it is presumed that whatever the act that has been passed is in favor of the constitutionality until and unless, right, the court is in favor of the act that is being passed by the Parliament until and unless it violates the fundamental rights of an individual that are guaranteed under Part 3 of the Constitution. Right? Now, if the provisions of a particular law or a rule is construed in such a way, right, as would make it consistent with the Constitution, and another interpretation would render the provision or the rule unconstitutional, the court would lean in favor of former construction. So let us say you have a law. The government interpreted in one way which conforms to the constitutionality of it, right? When it is interpreted from the view of the government, it stands in line with the constitutional principles. But on the other side, there is also another interpretation that means that it doesn't conform to constitutional principles, meaning it is unconstitutional. When on one side, if it is interpreted, it is constitutional. On the other side, if it is interpreted, it is unconstitutional. In that case, the court would lean in favor of the former, that is with the interpretation that conforms to constitutionality, until and unless when it violates the fundamental rights which are guaranteed under Part 3. Again, there are certain limitations here. What are those limitations? This presumption is not absolute. It doesn't happen every time. If there is a gross violation of the Constitution, the court is going to side with the side where the interpretation is unconstitutional. Then the act may stand the test of constitutionality in the courts. That is the presumption of constitutionality, right? Now, the CJI is suggesting that legislature can be reformed from within is admittedly the best solution to remedy legislative dysfunction without raising concerns of separation of powers. Absolutely. You cannot, there is already this thing called judicial activism. There is this already thing called presumption of constitutionality. But at the core of this issue, Reform from within is always better than outside interference, because in the initial I told you that these kinds of discussions raise the question of separation of powers. Again, if gone or done in a wrong way with wrong intent, the consequences would be far and wide. We have to be very respectful of separation of powers. We have to be very careful when we are discussing such issues where we talk about one organ of the government reforming the other organ of the government. Right? Moving on to the next article, logistics agreement with Russia to be signed soon. So what is this logistics agreement? Logistics agreement is nothing but you have an agreement with other country that allows your ships, right, your warships to be supplied by that country. Indian Navy is a high sea navy, blue water navy. Our operations are carried out far and wide around the globe, right? So when our navy ships are carrying out operations or conducting operations in high seas, there needs a time and point where the ships had to be replenished, right? They need fuel, they need food, and in the worst case scenario, these ships need some maintenance, and that has to be carried out at or during high sea operations. They cannot come back to their home base, which is far. So these agreements, these logistics agreement, allow Indian Navy to access the respective countries' resources. So let us say we have a logistics agreement with America. So when our ships are sailing in Pacific Ocean, if one of our ships break down, there is an issue in the engine bay, then what happens is, because we have the logistics agreement with America, American can supply the necessary equipment, the material, and if and when manpower to repair our ships in Pacific Ocean. Or let us say we have an logistics agreement with South Korea. Our ships are sailing in South China Sea. We need resupplies for our Navy personnel on board a naval ship. So we can ask South Korea to supply the necessary food supplies, and they would supply us because we have a logistics agreement. India has logistics agreement with US, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, and other countries too. But we don't have a logistics agreement with Russia. We signed our logistics agreement with America called LEMOA, that is Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, way back in 2016. India has a logistics agreement with almost all of the Quad partners. This agreement is significant because we discussed at various points of time how close Russia has been to China, and recently the statements from Kremlin and Russian President Putin supporting China, favoring China, and suggesting that India should get along with China despite the border tensions is a cause of concern for us, and has forced us to shift our policy in other directions. But nonetheless, exploring a closer ties, bilateral ties with Russia is always advantageous for us, right? This agreement comes at a point in time where the relation between India and Russia is being tested because of the Chinese interference. Again, this would enable us to access their resources. They would supply us with operational needs whenever our naval ships are carrying out high sea operations. So this is the Russian logistics agreement called Reciprocal Exchange of Logistics Agreement. What is the similar agreement with Americans? Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, LEMOA, which we signed in 2016. So we are soon to sign an agreement with Russia. We are on the precipice of signing another agreement, similar agreement with UK also. Thank you. Stay safe. Namaste.
Borthakur IAS Academy প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা
Borthakur IAS Academy